Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. I'm Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. This is our second interview today. This particular channel is getting quite popular. I have a very interesting guest today. Sandew Hira is the director of the Institute of Scientific Research, IISR, in The Hague. It's an institution which works on a variety of areas, but in particular into decolonizing the mind. And they've published a number of books under the series of Decolonizing the Mind with Amrit Publishers. He has studied economics at the Erasmus University Rotterdam, and in spite of that, is a very interesting thinker on colonial history. And I'm very pleased to bring him in because of his work as a secretary of the Decolonial International Network Foundation. Welcome to the show, Sandew.
Thank you for having me, Firoz. I'm very glad to be here, the first time that I got acquainted with the show. So thank you for the great work.
Well, thank you. Thanks. I guess, in this period, we get a lot of people talking about decolonizing. There's been decolonizing of university curricula, decolonizing of this, decolonizing of that. It's become a bit of a trendy word. Well, from your perspective, what are you trying to convey with that word? What does it mean for you?
Well, in the popular version of the word, decolonization is linked to the political independence of former colonies. So, and as they became independent, the idea was that decolonization has been fulfilled by being independent. Now, there are a lot of thinkers across the world who acknowledge that the influence of colonialism go beyond the politics. So even if the Dutch has left their colony in Suriname, the French has left their colony in Africa, and the British in the rest of the world, even if they left it, there are other dimensions that colonialism has established, particularly in the area of economics, economic independence, but moreover in the area of culture and knowledge production. So the ideas which we have in our daily narratives, these ideas have been shaped by colonialism. And 500 years of colonialism has created a system of knowledge in science that is translated through the media, radio, educational system, history books, the daily conversation. Many of these concepts have arisen in the era of colonialism, and particularly during the European Enlightenment. The basic concept of economics, which is profit maximization. They call it profit maximization, we call it greed. They call it objective, we call it subjective. The concept of politics with the separation of powers, the concept of class, individualism. There are a lot of ideas that have been produced by the Western Enlightenment, and that is now coming under criticism of decolonial thinkers, and say we need to have a different way of looking at the world, and don't accept the concepts, the ideas, the narratives that has been produced by Western institutions. So decolonization of the mind acknowledge that the mind has been colonized, which means that we are trained to think in a particular way. For example, in accepting the superiority of the West and the inferiority of the rest. So just one of the ideas that has been, or the superiority of Western political systems or Western economic systems, and the idea that civilizations before the European Enlightenment had nothing to offer to humanity. With the Bandung Conference in 1959 in Indonesia, there was the first attempt to take up this issue on the level of civilizational discourse. And so decolonizing the mind and decolonizing all the other things has to do with how you look at the world and how your perception of what you look at has been misformed by education.
I think that raises a really important point, that people forget that enlightenment, as Dominic Losordo puts it, gave birth to the conjoined twins of racism and liberalism. That you can't talk about one without talking about the other. Liberalism is an articulation of white supremacy, and so the struggles that have taken place to erode some of liberalism's exclusive project has been a function of struggles, which raises the question: is it possible then to decolonize the mind in the absence of struggle or of contestation against the powers of liberalism and its modern form, neoliberalism?
Yes. Well, I think it's good to take a historical comparison with another theory of liberation, as decolonizing the mind is a theory of liberation, which is socialism and Marxism, right? So Marxism came up as a theory of liberation, but within the confinements of the European Enlightenment. And then Marxism introduced the notion of class struggle, and had a theory of liberation that argues that private ownership of means of production, economic sphere, was the main cause of exploitation, and therefore in a new world you shouldn't have private enterprise and have a central planned economy. In terms of culture, religion would be abolished. People would be learned to think scientifically. In terms of political institutions, the state would fade away. So you don't have state structures. It seems utopian, but basically these were the central tenets of Marxism. So Marxism had about 150, 160 years in developing this theoretical framework, in articulating it and putting it into practice. And it has been put into practice since the Russian Revolution in 1917. And then the world came under the influence of that ideology and the system, and it lasted until 1989, when the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc withered away, the East Bloc withered away, and many of those countries didn't survive that system. So because of that, people were thinking, if Marxism is not that theory of liberation, has been tested but has not been sustainable, what are other theories of liberation? And this way you come to postmodernism, you come to Orientalism, and all kinds of other theoretical contributions to finding different narratives of liberation. So in that context, then you have discussions on very many levels. One of the basic levels is, what do we know about what truth is? What is truth and what is false? And in the decolonizing the theory as we develop it here, which is very young, only 10, 15 years, people have been writing about it. Therefore, they were individuals, but on a massive scale. It's 10, 15 years compared to Marxism is nothing. So we have a lot of contributions yet to be gained in the coming years. But one of the contributions is that in Europe, we have learned, in science, in the academia, we have learned that knowledge is about seeking the truth. Now, in Decolonizing the Mind, we argue that there's another dimension. Knowledge is about how to produce lies. So it's not only about seeking truth, it's how lies are produced. So the lies that Columbus has discovered America is very well vested in all the educational textbooks across the world. It was a lie. We know now better. And there are many other lies which have been produced. So in discussing theoretically how is a lie constructed, how do people construct a lie, that type of thinking is not present in the academia when they talk about knowledge production. See? And that is something we deal with. We look at how terminology is used in producing a lie, how narratives are constructed, how facts are selected subjectively, not taking all facts into account, how ethics is separated from knowledge. Knowledge has a big ethical component. For example, what is the right political system? It's not a scientific discussion, it's an ethical discussion. It's about how do you deal with greed, and in capitalism they found that greed, we call it maximum profit maximization. So it seems something objective, but it's an ethical construction. So looking into many of these concepts, we can discover how lies are constructed. And in deconstructing the lie, we are decolonizing the mind.
I mean, Marx's fundamental aspiration was about the emancipation of humanity. Okay, I mean that was his driving force. But to paraphrase some of his thinking, and which several people otherwise have put it, that academia posits that you need to think before you act, but in reality, it is only through the engagement of in struggles that you learn how to think. So I'm looking for where your connection of the project of decolonizing the mind connects with real struggles in which that dialectical transformation of the way one thinks it takes place. Because I want to move this then to then what does it mean in terms of a period of a pandemic, which is being so appallingly criminally managed, how that then relates. So first, let me deal with the connection between even the definition of what you define as knowledge and its relationship to struggle.
All right. So let me take the case of Malcolm X. Many of the ideas which are being produced in this whole movement of decolonizing the mind and decolonial theory doesn't come from academics. It came from activists. Malcolm X has articulated many concepts that we use today. For example, the concept of the house Negro, in how the ruling power manipulates sections of the oppressed in order to maintain its oppression. Malcolm X came up with that concept and many other concepts. For example, Malcolm X came up with the concept that if you stick a knife 10 inches in my back and you pull it out 3 inches, you haven't done me a favor. And that is how we look at, for example, how the abolition of slavery is discussed in history textbooks. It has been seen as an emancipation of Black people and not as sticking a knife 10 inches and taking it away 3 inches, because after the abolition of slavery in the United States, they had apartheid until the 60s, and racism still there. So first of all, we look into activism for concept of how to look at the world, and then the next step, how to organize in the struggle. Now, Marxism made, although it's a part of Enlightenment, did make a lot of interesting contributions. For example, the Leninist concept of the vanguard party, right? Where you organize dedicated revolutionaries in a party, train them for the moment that there is a revolutionary situation in which they lead a revolution and take state power, destroy the institution of capitalism, etc. Now, we have seen the result of it in some countries, and in other countries, it worked in a different way. But now, in these times of crisis, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what kind of organizational models have been produced in activism for organizing the struggle? In the state of Chiapas in Mexico, the Zapatistas came up with this idea that leaders are people who follow and basically follow the instinct and the ideas of the masses and are subservient to it. The ideas that you could organize not in one central way, but in decentralized way. Although the problem is still, if you have decentralized organization, how do you coordinate these decentral things? And the Corona crisis now offers us interesting possibilities. How technology now can become a much more useful instrument in organizing. Now we are discussing and doing educational work and communication, but there is an organizational aspect of it. If I share this link on my Facebook, a few thousand people might follow it. Others share it, we have much more members, and so you could have many people discussing ideas. But then we need to go further and discuss the question of how does a new world look like after Corona, after COVID. And one concept which we are introducing is the need for an other world civilization. And let me explain what it is. If you are living in Mexico in 1650, in the 17th century, 18th century, early 18th century, the almighty power of Spain was the imperial power at that time. Spain was so big in the mind of the people that nobody could think that there would be a time where Spain wouldn't be associated with imperial power, but would be just an ordinary country like hundreds of other countries. Now we are living in 2020. If I tell you within 50 years, the association of the United States of America with imperial power will be gone, we are envisioning the end of the American empire, the end of the Western empire. The world will change dramatically. You won't believe it because you're still, your mindset is still accepting the imperial power, the omnipotent imperial power of US imperialism. But
you think it's going to last that long?
Well, 50 years is a short time in the period of history. But don't forget, the United States came to power in the last 50 years. I mean, when they took over at the beginning of this century, with all the imperial thing, it is with the Second World War that they established military bases all across the world. They started all in 1989, in the Philippines and in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean. But their almighty power with the economic institution, political, military might, all the invasion they have done, their power was at the height in the last 50 years. I don't give them even 50 years.
But let's now look at, okay, what does decolonizing the mind mean in relation to the pandemic?
It means that we should acknowledge that this pandemic is a turning point in world history.
How?
Compare it with, it's the turning point in the way you see China and the United States now in dealing with the pandemic. The United States was unprepared for it. The United States, with all its might and its technological know-how and its infrastructure, has now 7 or 8 times more death than China had. So the rise of China as an imperial power and the decline of the United States as an imperial power That rivalry and that turning point is what this corona crisis means. It means that in the balance of power, the shift will go towards China, and United States will be losing it. That is what corona has shown us.
But what does it mean in terms of organizing?
Okay, now here comes the question, which we don't have the answers yet, but we have the methodology to find answers. One thing is this: if we were living in 1929 with a crisis then, the answer was the communist parties of those times. They were the organizational focal point, and we have to learn from their successes and their failures. And now we don't have a third international like it used to be after the Russian Revolution. So activists across the world should try to figure out now, how do you challenge state power? In the old communist tradition, I came from a Marxist tradition. The answer was quite clear: is that you need to take over the state by a communist party. If that is not the case, what are other mechanisms of challenging state power? Is that on a local level, and is that through that could be different per country. For example, in Holland, where the rise of racism and the rise of the extreme right has created a political party of people of color with now 3 seats in parliament. And they articulate the problems of racism in a much sharper way than was ever done before. And by doing so, they help strengthen the organization on a local level of people at the universities, in the schools, in the workplaces, in the communities. So we have to think about this question of what types of organization could be there, and not one type. Why cannot a variety of organizational model be there, depending on the situation per country? So we need to discuss this, yes.
You drew earlier on to the example of the Zapatistas in Chiapas. And I think one of the most striking things about the way they organize is that they work on the principle that actually they recognize and accept that people are able to think. And I think one of the problems with the vanguardist approach perhaps has been that there is perhaps a lack of adequate acknowledgement that people do think.
Subcomandante Marcos articulated it in one of his interviews, said, we went into the communities as Marxists, as Leninists, Marxist-Leninists, and came out as Zapatistas. And what he meant is they came into the communities with these vanguardist concepts, and then suddenly saw that the Maya communities had already concepts of power, concept of organization, concept of how to organize a community, and they learned from it. And that is one of the things we should do now also. Look at the experience of the different struggle. What goes in Holland might not go for the United States. What goes in the global north might not go in the global south. The interesting experience in Venezuela now, with the Chavista revolution, is very interesting. And also the interesting experience in Iran with the Iranian revolution. All these revolutions have their own dynamics and their own things. And by looking at how they function in relation to the classical revolutions, in Venezuela, Chavez came to power by elections, while the traditional Marxist analysis was, the elections wouldn't bring you to power. It was a revolutionary situation that will bring you to power. So I think by engaging with these revolutions, I was in Venezuela this year. In fact, last year, twice. And I saw firsthand how people were organizing. There was a demonstration of 1 million people against Guaido and the imperialist threat of invasion there. And then you talk to people, one of the biggest things I noticed is the level of political education and the consciousness of a lot of those people, that despite this hard times Venezuela is going through, they were still able to stand before the revolution, although Chavez had died. See? And that is things we can learn from, how education and organization should go hand in hand together.
But let me pose this question. I'm maybe a bit tough, but to say to you, well, I haven't heard what is needed to deal with a pandemic which is killing, especially most dispossessed African Americans in the U.S., Latinos. You will see, I think, in the coming period in Africa, you will see those who live in shack dwellers in the ghettos and so on will be the ones who will be most affected. Now, here you are. We need to decolonize the mind. Are you saying we have to take state power before we can engage in the struggle against the COVID?
No, there are two things we should do, I think. One is to educate people about the inability of many of the states, the current powers, to deal with the crisis. And look at how countries that are not under such powers, look how Venezuela deals with Corona. They have been doing the testing, they have been doing the educational and the popular mobilization. There's no popular mobilization in the United States. There's no popular mobilization in Europe, but in those countries like in Cuba and even in China, popular mobilization, get the people involved in testing, education, etc., was an important thing. And how come that we don't have those institutions of popular mobilizations? So there's your link. Is how to use this crisis and argue that we need to build infrastructures of popular mobilization and deal with all the problems that come with it, which is diversity of opinion, leadership, communication, how to deal with egos, the culture of organization, the culture of tolerance, all these things we'll have to deal with. If you expect one magical answer that gives you the stick with which you could solve all problems, I can't give you that. I won't have the pretension to give that.
So finally, let's just look at the way who are being most affected by the COVID epidemic in the Netherlands, and what are the directions? What needs to be done? How do you organize in a time when the most oppressed, the most exploited are also those who, I presume, are affected?
Okay, let's take the case of Holland, right? The judge, they pride themselves as having a intelligent lockdown. That is their word. They use the word intelligent lockdown, which means not a total lockdown. They don't do testing here. They just say to people, be careful, keep a distance, and that's it. That is not intelligent at all. Take other countries, and the Dutch now have more deaths than China. And per day, between 150 and 200 people are dying every day. And within 4 weeks, 3,000 people have died in Holland. But the media doesn't use those figures. Those figures are mentioned, but the whole propaganda machine is on how well the government is doing in dealing with the crisis in terms of increasing the beds at the intensive care units, etc. But if you look at how they prepared for the crisis, there were warnings early at the end of January that this was coming, and for a month they did nothing. So now we have to break through that barrier of misinformation and explain people that it would have been possible, and still is possible, to set up a system of testing, massive testing in Holland. Now they are considering it, but they haven't done it for a month, and they haven't put up the infrastructure. So social movement here are more or less atomized. There's no large structured organizational structure, so everybody's on its own island. And that we need to think about how, when this crisis is over, what lesson do we draw in terms of connecting all the social movements in a more coherent way to deal with the mismanagement of the state.
So currently, what are the programs that the Decolonizing International Network is engaged in Holland, in the Netherlands?
One of the things is we are trying to set up a cadre school that links the different social movements together and let people communicate and try to set up programs for education and discussing decolonizing the mind in the workflow, in the educational institution, in the media, and put it there on the agenda, and training the people to be able to carry it and make contributions to it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us on this show on organizing in the time of COVID. I really appreciate your taking time off from your work to join us.
Thank you very much, Firas.
Okay, and we wish you all the best in the coming period. And
you too.
Keep safe and keep well.
You too. Thank you very much. Okay. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Goodbye then.
Bye.
This is Feroz Manchi signing off on Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. We'll be back again tomorrow.